In 1984, a ham radio enthusiast in West Germany picked up a strange signal, one not listed on any frequency chart. The message was garbled, intermittent, but unmistakably Soviet, and filled with numbers. What he didn't know was that he had just intercepted one of the KGB's most daring espionage broadcasts, one that emanated from a radio tower no longer supposed to function. The story opens in East Berlin, 1983. A decommissioned Soviet radio tower, stripped of its broadcasting rights after a lightning strike damaged its upper array, suddenly becomes active late at night. It's not public radio or propaganda. It's a numbers station, sequences of spoken digits read in a calm female voice. Western intelligence brushes it off. But then, strange things start happening. Valery Sokolov's footsteps echoed through the dim concrete stairwell of the defunct tower like whispers from the past, a fitting soundtrack for a man the world had forgotten. Once a prodigious radio technician lauded for pioneering frequency-hopping techniques for Soviet field units, he had now been reduced, on paper, to a janitor at the Ministry of Communications. To most, he was the faded wallpaper of the regime, an invisible man pushing a mop, aging quietly amid rusting equipment and faded propaganda posters. But Valery still held the keys, literal and metaphorical. Officially, the tower had been decommissioned in 1979 after a lightning strike crippled its main array, its skeletal frame left to rot under a gray East Berlin sky. But Valery saw opportunity in the wreckage. He returned at night under the cover of shift work, unlocking rusted doors and navigating beneath the tower into its forgotten bunker-level basement. There, he repurposed broken consoles and salvaged transmitters, rewiring their guts like a surgeon performing back-alley operations with smuggled tools. He replaced cracked capacitors with black market parts, restored vacuum tubes stolen from ministry storage, and insulated wiring with scavenged rubber tape. Piece by piece, he rebuilt a broadcast station hidden in plain sight, one the state assumed was dead. But his resurrection wasn't for music or Soviet morale boosting. Valery had resurrected the tower for espionage. He had devised a protocol where strings of numbers, read in monotonous female voices synthesized from salvaged voice modulators, were broadcast across shortwave frequencies at seemingly random intervals. These weren't weather updates or coded poetry, they were activation codes, dead drop signals, and movement orders for Soviet assets buried across NATO territories. The beauty was in the simplicity. Each agent had a unique cipher key, some embedded in phone books, others in chess manuals or grocery receipts, so no single broadcast made sense unless you had the personal decoder. By bouncing his signals through the fragmented antenna array, Valery had created a rogue system of long-range agent coordination, undetected by Central Soviet Command and invisible to NATO. To everyone in the ministry, Valery was just an eccentric with a twitch and too many opinions about soldering. But to the network of sleeper agents scattered across West Germany, France, and Belgium, he was the silent god of war, the ghost operator, transmitting fate from the shadows of a tower that officially no longer existed. He worked alone, slept little, and kept no written records. The codes lived in his head, the frequencies shifted weekly, and the clockwork broadcasts were his only confession. As the Iron Curtain thickened and mistrust flourished on both sides, Valery remained the invisible pulse of a secret war, his broken tower humming like a ghost breathing through steel lungs. While ministries issued memos and soldiers stared at maps, he sent the signals that turned the wheels of betrayal, blackmail, and blood. And as dawn crept through the shattered windows above, the janitor locked the door behind him, mop in hand, leaving no trace but a faint signal crawling westward into the static. From the outside, the signals were nothing more than static, distorted fragments of a broken broadcast crawling across shortwave bands that most nations had long since abandoned. But within that apparent chaos, wrapped in the lulling cadence of a synthesized woman's voice repeating numbers in groups of 4 and 5, lived commands that could activate, redirect, or silence Soviet operatives embedded across NATO countries. These weren't ordinary ciphered messages passed in secret notes or whispered in safe houses. They were camouflaged within radio waves no one was meant to hear. Each message followed a tight structure known only to the ghost operator, Valery Sokolov, and to those agents who had received his custom-built field manuals, often disguised as harmless objects, tourist maps, opera playbills, or seemingly outdated railway schedules. Within these decoys were embedded individualized one-time pad systems, often based on locally specific routines, like the fifth seat from the left in the seventh row of a cinema, or the page and word number in a library's Russian-language edition of Robinson Crusoe. So, when Valery broadcasted 4129-7632-8110, it wasn't just gibberish. It was a quiet roar to a sleeper in Vienna to activate his secondary drop box near the Schönbrunn Palace Gardens, or an alert to a handler in Brussels to abandon a compromised contact point and pivot to an emergency escape route coded Orpheus. The genius of Valery's system was its invisibility, not because it was untraceable, but because no one was looking. Western monitoring stations had logged the transmissions for years, cataloging them as remnants of forgotten spy games from the early Cold War, the electronic ghosts of disused Soviet protocols. And even within the KGB's own central apparatus, the broadcasts from Tower 472 weren't on any schedule, didn't appear in any dispatch logs, and couldn't be traced to an authorized department. That was by design. Valery operated outside the strict doctrine of centralized control, under the belief that true operational security came not from tighter chains of command, but from total disconnection. No paper trail, no confirmation signals, no need for handlers to pass along the orders. The broadcasts were the orders. The agents merely listened. That broken tower, cracked, weathered, graffiti-stained, had become the mouthpiece of a silent empire nested within an empire, a rogue communication channel hidden in plain sound. Even when the CIA's frequency analysts stumbled across the odd repeating sequences, they dismissed them as Cold War relics or deliberate noise injected to waste American time. Valery counted on that assumption. The real brilliance wasn't just in how he hid the signal, but in how he made it look like it didn't matter. Meanwhile, lives were upended in Frankfurt, data vanished in Oslo, and a defector in Rome never showed for his extraction, because Valery had whispered a number. To the outside world, the tower was dead. But to the agents who still remembered the math behind the madness, it was very much alive, speaking to them in code, one number at a time. Long before Valery Sokolov became a ghost haunting a dead radio tower, he had been a rising star in the lecture halls and underground labs of Leningrad University, a student whose mind moved faster than the professors who tried to contain it. He enrolled in the Faculty of Radio Physics in 1968, a quiet, pale young man from a provincial military town who spoke little but listened obsessively, absorbing equations and signal theory with unnerving speed. While his classmates focused on approved applications, civil broadcasting, radar calibration, weather telemetry, Valery became fixated on what happened between frequencies, on bleed-through, distortion, reflection, and the strange ways signals bent, disappeared, and reappeared when pushed beyond their intended limits. He spent nights experimenting with scavenged receivers, running unauthorized tests that bounced shortwave transmissions off the ionosphere, mapping how they could skip borders without touching the ground in between. By 1971, he had produced a crude but functional model showing how fragmented antenna arrays could scatter and recombine signals in ways that confused conventional triangulation methods. That model found its way, quietly, into the hands of the KGB. In 1972, Valery was invited, not officially recruited, never formally asked, to attend a research consultation at a nondescript office near the Neva River. The men there didn't talk about ideology or loyalty or the West. They talked about noise, about hiding messages inside useless transmissions, about how wars were no longer fought only with tanks, but with information that could move unseen. Valery didn't need convincing. He needed problems to solve. For 3 years, he worked in restricted facilities, refining techniques that allowed messages to masquerade as failures, designing broadcasts that looked broken even when they were functioning perfectly. His work impressed senior officers who had spent decades hunting Western spies, men who rarely praised anyone. But Valery never learned the other half of survival inside the Soviet system: politics. He didn't attend the right dinners. He didn't flatter department heads. He openly criticized inefficient protocols and centralized command structures, arguing that rigid hierarchies made intelligence operations predictable and fragile. Worse, he refused party membership, claiming truthfully that ideology interfered with objective signal analysis. That refusal marked him. By 1910, his access was quietly reduced. By 1979, after a particularly blunt memorandum criticizing KGB broadcast redundancy doctrine circulated too widely, he was removed from classified work entirely. No trial, no accusation, just reassignment. Janitorial duty at the Ministry of Communications. To his superiors, it was exile without martyrdom, a way to bury a difficult mind without creating questions. They assumed humiliation would break him, that isolation would turn brilliance into bitterness. What they failed to understand was that Valery Madavilas had never cared about rank or recognition. He cared about systems. And when he was left alone with keys, forgotten buildings, and broken infrastructure no one bothered to monitor anymore, he found something better than authority. He found freedom. The punishment meant to erase him. Instead placed him exactly where he needed to be, close to dead machines, abandoned frequencies, and a tower the state had already stopped listening to. They never knew his name. The men and women who waited in silent apartments in Cologne, in modest bookshops in Lisbon, or in the shadows of shipping yards in Rotterdam didn't know who issued their orders. They only knew the time, the frequency, and the voice. Some swore it was a woman's voice, reading numbers in a dreamlike monotone. Others claimed it was a synthetic hybrid, metallic, unnatural, almost hypnotic. But for all of them, that voice meant one thing: activation. Valery Sokolov's rogue broadcast protocol was unlike anything sanctioned by Soviet intelligence. It circumvented handlers, safe houses, and the unreliable human chain of communication that often broke under pressure. Instead, he created a system where each agent operated in a vacuum, armed only with a one-time cipher, a radio receiver, and blind trust. The messages were brief, never longer than 60 seconds, and arrived irregularly. At 3:17 a.m. on a Tuesday, or just before midnight on the first Sunday of a new moon. They were structured in sets of digits and pause intervals, each sequence triggering a unique behavioral routine hidden in plain sight. Check the 13th page of your Bible, look under the 6th step of a stairwell, or purchase a particular item at a particular shop. It was espionage by implication. A flicker in behavior, a misaligned object, a silent rendezvous confirmed only by matching rituals. Valéry's brilliance wasn't in inventing anything new, but in engineering a system that didn't look like a system. No known couriers, no physical drop boxes, no traceable meetings. Just a dying tower emitting nonsense into the static, heard only by those trained to listen. By the early 1980s, the pattern began to ripple across Europe. A NATO logistics official in Milan suffered a sudden fatal car crash, days after a local station reported strange shortwave interference. Classified missile test data from a base in northern Norway leaked through a supposedly secure line, a Western. Operative embedded in a Berlin tech firm simply vanished. The randomness was too clean to be chance, but too subtle to be definitively linked. Inside NATO's intelligence circles, some analysts began to note these anomalies on internal charts, red pins scattered across cities that had no known Soviet operations. They called it the phantom effect. But the Soviet command structure, ironically, was no wiser. Valery operated without their knowledge, cultivating a dozen key agents and dozens more soft echoes, secondary assets triggered by agents he'd never meet. These operatives were loyal not to the Kremlin, but to the system itself, believing it to be an ultra-covert cell buried deep in the intelligence hierarchy. They never suspected it was being run by a janitor beneath a crippled broadcast tower. For 5 years, the system functioned flawlessly, hidden by its own absurdity. And as intelligence services searched for a mole, a courier, a leak, anything, they overlooked the simplest, most ancient tactic of all, the message that no one believes is a message. That was Valery's network. Silent, invisible, and growing. Hans Keller wasn't supposed to matter, just another West German telecom analyst whose official job was to monitor signal bandwidth congestion between regional broadcasting towers. He worked in a modest office in Bonn by day, filing spectral analysis reports no one read, but by night he retreated into the chaos of static, a passionate radio hobbyist hunched over a custom-built receiver that sprawled across his apartment like a post-war relic. He logged everything: frequency, time, location, modulation, anomalies, an obsessive's dream scribbled across notebooks and annotated maps. It started as a curiosity, a faint signal, almost skeletal, rising from the East Berlin airwaves on a frequency long listed as decommissioned. What drew his attention wasn't the strength, it was the consistency. The signal always came on a Thursday, just past 2 a.m., for exactly 73 seconds. The voice was mechanical, sexless, listing numbers with hypnotic calm. At first, Hans assumed it was a residual broadcast from Cold War-era Soviet numbers stations, the kind of thing hobbyists traded as novelties. But then came the second anomaly. The voice changed slightly, as if modulated on a different analog unit, and the sequences became less random. He compared notes over months and noticed a subtle pattern, digits that repeated with impossible precision. He reported the activity to the Bundesnachrichtendienst, BND, Germany's federal intelligence agency, including frequency logs and a directional scan that suggested the signal originated from a long-dead East Berlin tower. But the response was dismissive. Outdated Cold War noise, not a threat, not worth the time. Still, Hans couldn't let it go. He began mapping the dates of these broadcasts, marking them on a wall calendar beside global headlines. That's when he noticed something strange. The morning after each signal, something happened. Not locally, but somewhere in Western Europe. A NATO logistics failure in Lille. Train derailment in Rotterdam that disrupted military cargo. A government contractor's suicide in Madrid. No one else saw the correlation. But to Hans, it was glaring. He color-coded each event, cross-referenced timing, and built a spiderweb of pins and string that transformed his wall into a map of calculated chaos. Every Thursday broadcast matched with a Friday incident, small enough to go unnoticed, but tactically precise. He returned to the BND, now armed with correlation graphs and timing overlays. Still, no action. Frustrated, he mailed the entire dossier to a contact at the CIA's Berlin station, an old acquaintance from a ham radio conference years prior. Days later, that contact vanished, disappeared from every registry Hans could find. Paranoia took root. He started copying his notes, storing them in separate locations, encrypting files under fake music metadata, and recording every single Thursday broadcast. One night, just past 2:03 a.m., the voice shifted, mid-transmission, a static pulse, a high-pitched warble, then nothing. Hans stared at the receiver, heart hammering. Whatever he'd been tracking had just noticed him. By the spring of 1985, the whispers that had drifted across NATO's intelligence networks reached the right ears at Langley, ears trained to recognize patterns in noise and sabotage hidden in coincidence. A mid-level analyst in signals intelligence, cross-referencing Keller's anonymous dossier with several incidents of low-level NATO disruption, flagged the transmissions as unidentified persistent broadcast source, high priority. Within weeks, the CIA had assembled a quiet interagency task force under a sanitized title, Operation Silent Dial. The mission was simple in writing and impossible in practice. Identify the origin of a rogue broadcast heard sporadically on shortwave bands across Western Europe, believed to be coordinating unsanctioned Soviet-aligned activities. At the heart of the task force was Agent Claire Redford, an experienced field officer dispatched to West Berlin under the cover of a cultural attaché. Fluent in German and radio theory, Redford posed as a liaison between American and European telecommunications agencies, but her true purpose lay in meticulously sweeping the electromagnetic spectrum for irregular bursts and triangulating the signal's source with mobile receivers hidden in diplomatic vehicles. Within her first month, they detected the voice firsthand, monotone, clinical, cascading numbers over the narrow band that pulsed with chilling precision. The signal appeared every Thursday night, lasting exactly 73 seconds, bouncing across sectors with a ghost-like elusiveness that earned it the codename Ghost Voice. What Claire didn't know, what no one at Langley or within her task force suspected, was that their interest had already triggered a silent alarm. Back in East Berlin, in the Ministry of Communications, a man named Emil Bräutigam, an unassuming stenographer with a pale face and a mind for patterns, worked as an informant not for the Stasi or the Soviet KGB, but for Valery Sokolov. Years earlier, Valery had befriended him with quiet consistency, fixing his faulty radio, passing him banned Polish jazz tapes, and treating him with a kindness that no one else in the building offered. Emil, in turn, began whispering things. Who visited from Moscow, what memos passed across desks, which security clearances had been reviewed. And now, he told Valery something that made the blood in his veins chill. American diplomats were requesting technical frequency audits on defunct towers, and a woman from the U.S. Embassy had visited the East Berlin Telecommunications Library 3 times in 1 week. Valery understood instantly. His transmissions were no longer ignored. The game had changed. And so, beneath the rusted girders of Tower 472, in the midnight hum of vacuum teas and homemade circuits, Valery began reconfiguring everything, scrambling his modulation sequence, rotating cipher intervals, and preparing a dead man protocol. He'd built his empire under the assumption that no one was listening. Now, he had to assume they were, and if the Americans were knocking at the edge of the void he'd crafted, he would meet them not with silence, but with distortion. Signals that bent back on themselves, truths buried beneath static, and a voice that was never supposed to be heard, whispering just loud enough to lure them deeper. Valery Sokolov had always built his system on precision, on schedules that mimicked the mechanical exactness of a Cold War satellite clock, on patterns so rigorously timed they passed beneath suspicion. But now, pressure frayed that perfection. The first mistake came quietly. A Thursday night transmission arrived 12 minutes early. It was a seemingly small error, but for Agent Pilgrim, an embedded courier in Lyon, it was catastrophic. He had trained for months to listen only during his narrow time window, tuning in from a modified radio buried in the false bottom of a wine crate. That week, he missed the message entirely. Frantic, he reached out to his contact using an emergency signal, an act strictly forbidden unless compromised. That ping alerted both local authorities and the CIA, who had been monitoring unexplained electromagnetic spikes around the city after recent intelligence leaks. Within 72 hours, Pilgrim was arrested. Under pressure, sleep deprivation, and the calculated softness of psychological interrogation, he broke, not loudly, not fully, but enough. He spoke of the numbers, of the voice, of a broken tower they believed dead. He didn't know names. He didn't know locations, but he revealed the pattern. Thursday signals, always from the east, always from a signal with shifting harmonics. In Langley, those crumbs aligned with Hans Keller's existing timeline, and a signal triangulation protocol was initiated. 3 portable spectrum analyzers, disguised as embassy equipment, were deployed to West Berlin, Frankfurt, and Hamburg. They listened not only for the numbers, but for the exact signal decay unique to the ghost voice, a signature harmonic distortion that left a fingerprint in the white noise. The data narrowed the broadcast's origin to a 1 square mile sector of East Berlin, a no-man's land between Kreuzberg and the Spree, an area pocked with derelict factories and skeletal towers from the pre-wall era, the Bauer. CEA, in partnership with West German SIGINT and supported unofficially by MI6, greenlit an aggressive electronic warfare probe. Their plan? Flood the frequency with noise, force the ghost voice to change its channel, and trace its fallback transmission. To do that, they began probing nearby frequencies with controlled bursts, spikes designed to trigger defensive frequency hopping. Meanwhile, East Berlin's Ministry of Communications began to sense something was wrong, noticing irregular energy surges from Tower 472, which was, on all records, dead. But Valery was already aware of the storm brewing. Bräutigams' whispered warnings, the sudden tightening of ministry surveillance, and now the failed message to Lyon, it all painted a picture of collapse. Worse still, in the scramble to correct the botched signal, Valery had uploaded the wrong encryption pad to his voice synthesizer. A second agent in Copenhagen received garbled digits that, when decrypted improperly, instructed her to abort and burn an entire drop site prematurely. The message had intended to activate her, not isolate her. And with every mistake, the veil thinned. The tower, once a whisper in the noise, was becoming a beacon. Valery knew he was being hunted, not as a soldier, not even as a traitor, but as a signal. And the noise was closing in. The transmission was already underway when they breached the tower. Valery Sokolov, pale and skeletal in the flickering glow of cathode screens, sat alone at the console like a priest before an altar of forgotten frequencies, his fingers trembling over the worn brass key of the transmitter as the synthesized voice echoed its final call into the void. It was his fail-safe, an all-points activation embedded with cascading ciphers, timed rotations, and burning protocols. a last desperate push to awaken every agent, sleeper, courier, and ghost who had ever received his numbers. From Antwerp to Prague, from Lisbon to Bergen, if they still had ears and codes, they would move. The signal sliced through static like a whisper into a scream, riding the shortwave bands as if it were a prophecy being fulfilled. But it was already too late. Behind the operation, unseen but looming, Moscow had grown uneasy. The anomalies, the American interest, the surge in radio triangulation efforts, and the looming threat of exposure created a diplomatic pressure cooker that East Berlin could not ignore. Under the guise of equipment recovery and decommissioning, a quiet task force of Stasi operatives, led by Major Gunther Stahl, entered the grounds of Tower 472 in unmarked vehicles at 2:13 a.m. They moved without fanfare, bypassing civilian guards with forged clearances, and entering the long-abandoned communications bunker that, to their knowledge, had been silent for 6 years. But inside, they found something else entirely. Maps of European cities covered in red wax pencil lines littered the walls. Shelves stacked with notebooks, each filled with numerical logs and hand-drawn encryption schemes, surrounded a control board resurrected from scavenged World War II military hardware. Dials twitched under weak pulses of brr, and an array of humming tube amplifiers cast shadows like dying stars. In the center of it all, Valeri, gaunt, wild-eyed, and hunched over the control unit, still broadcasting, didn't look up. He knew they were there. He had known for weeks. The fail-safe message, encoded in the dying breath of a system designed never to outlive its creator, finished just as boots hit the floor. The final numbers hung in the air, trailing off into the hiss of static. The men surrounded him, weapons lowered but ready, as if they were uncertain whether they were confronting a man or something else, a relic that refused to die. Valeri didn't resist. He looked at them, slow and unblinking, then back at his console as if expecting it to continue without him. "They're awake now," he said quietly, voice barely audible over the hiss of the speakers. "You're already too late." The lead officer motioned for the transmission equipment to be shut down, and as the relay tubes dimmed and the tower above went silent for the first time in years, no one noticed that beneath the console, a smaller transceiver, the true heart of Valeri's network, continued to pulse, sending out one last flicker of data on an entirely different frequency, one they hadn't found yet. They took him in the dark, without cuffs, without ceremony, without even a documented chain of custody, just a silent hand on his shoulder, a nod to the agents flanking the rusted stairwell, and a van that pulled away from Tower 472 as if it had never stopped. Valery Sokolov vanished into the folds of the Soviet security apparatus like steam into concrete, leaving behind only cold machines and warm confusion. There was no arrest report, no court-martial, no public statement about espionage or unauthorized broadcasts. Officially, the tower had been unpowered since 1979, and when questions trickled into internal East German files about electromagnetic interference events, they were quietly amended or buried. Within the KGB's encrypted intranet, an internal memo marked Level 12, Spectral Asset Review noted an unsanctioned agent engaging in irregular long-range encoding activities, but even that was redacted weeks later. The Western intelligence community, freshly buzzed with excitement after the signal went dark, assumed they had forced a successful shutdown, but no confirmation came. No corpse, no show trial, no defector with a tale to tell. Valery, for all practical purposes, ceased to exist. Yet, among certain corridors in Moscow, his name was spoken in hushed tones, a myth edged with dread and admiration. Some claimed he was executed within days, stripped of his clothes, shot in the back of the neck, and buried outside the Lubyanka with the others who had gone too far. Others, particularly those deep in Soviet scientific circles, whispered of a different fate, that he had been spirited away to a black site facility in the frozen tundra of the Yamalo-Nenets Autonomous Okrug, where failed scientists and dangerous thinkers were reabsorbed into the state's shadow laboratories. There, they said, he worked with old vacuum relay systems to build untraceable cipher algorithms and ghost networks meant to operate even if the Kremlin itself fell. A few believed he had never stopped broadcasting, that in some frigid basement beneath a Siberian research outpost, Valery sat hunched over a custom rig, his numbers now echoing through spectral bands no civilian receiver could hear. Whatever the truth, the immediate result was undeniable. The tower went silent. The Thursday signals ceased. The numbers vanished. The transmissions that had whispered activation into the ears of a dozen covert agents simply disappeared, as if they had been a hallucination. NATO marked the event with cautious satisfaction, but Hans Keller wasn't so sure. On a rainy November night, months after the disappearance, he tuned in again, 2 a.m. on a hunch, and caught something faint. Not numbers, not a voice, but a soft pulse, modulated in 4 repeating tones. It lasted 17 seconds, too short to analyze, too clean to be random. He logged it, marked the time, and waited. A week later, the same pattern, then nothing, then again. Someone, or something, was still transmitting. And though the tower was sealed, its windows boarded, its equipment seized or stripped, those who had once answered to the ghost voice couldn't shake the feeling that the silence was only temporary, that a signal, like memory, could be buried but never truly killed. It was February 23, 92, and the snow outside Helsinki fell in slow spirals, blanketing rooftops and antenna arrays in a silence that felt ancient, almost ceremonial. In a narrow third-floor apartment, Arto Vainio, a retired telecom engineer and lifelong shortwave hobbyist, adjusted the dials of his aging Yaesu receiver, chasing faint broadcasts across fading Soviet bands as he had done since the Brezhnev years. The Cold War had ended, the wall had fallen, and the old tension that once hummed beneath every frequency had mostly given way to silence or static, abandoned voices from a dismantled empire. But that night, at precisely 02:03 a.m., Arto's rig caught something strange, something impossible. A burst of clean signal emerged from the static, almost timid at first, then perfectly clear. A calm female voice, mechanical and cold, began speaking in Russian-accented English, reciting a sequence of numbers in even 5-digit groupings. 17290 46482 80155. The transmission lasted 73 seconds, then silence. Arto froze, the hairs on his neck rising. The voice was identical to a recording he'd heard on tape in 1986. One of the mysterious numbers stations Western hobbyists had long speculated were Soviet espionage tools, but that station, everyone knew, had gone dark after '85, when the infamous ghost voice vanished along with all associated transmissions. No one had heard anything since. And yet, here it was again, on the exact same frequency, 10.191 MHz, long abandoned, long forgotten. Arto documented everything: timestamp, frequency strength, weather conditions, signal path, and shared the log with his small international radio forum. Most dismissed it as a fluke, a glitch, a looping echo from old military hardware accidentally triggered by collapsing infrastructure. But others weren't so sure. A retired British signals analyst chimed in, noting the voice's cadence and tone matched samples recorded from the now legendary Berlin Ghost broadcasts in the early '80s. A former Stasi cryptographer, posting under a pseudonym, claimed the string structure bore unmistakable hallmarks of operational cipher blocks. Rumors ignited. Some whispered that Valery Sokolov had survived, that he had escaped the Gulag or been quietly reinstated into a hidden lab when the KGB fractured, continuing his work under the radar of the crumbling state. Others theorized the broadcast was an automated dead man's switch, set to resume if no signal was sent to disable it, a last gasp of a system built to function without human hands. The Finnish Ministry of Communications investigated the signal and found nothing. No towers active on that band, no weather balloons, no repeaters. The origin remained a mystery. And then, 2 weeks later, it happened again. Same time, same frequency, same voice, more numbers. The message, if it was one, remained undeciphered, but something had returned. Something that had waited in the dark, dormant but not dead, pulsing beneath the fabric of peace like a ghost too stubborn to vanish. The tower had fallen. The war had ended, but the voice had not. In a world that had moved on, one man's signal still clawed its way into the air, repeating its cipher like a prayer for sleepers who might never wake again. Or worse, already had. If you found this story as haunting and fascinating as we did, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss another Cold War secret unearthed. And tell us in the comments, do you think Valery ever stopped broadcasting? Or are his signals still out there, waiting to be heard again?